war has never been fought with courage alone. It has always been fought with money, and the history of how wars are financed is in many ways the hidden history of the modern financial system itself. When I look at warfare across centuries, I do not begin with battlefields or generals, but with ledgers, taxes, and promises made to people who were not fighting but paying. Every major leap in finance has been pulled forward by the same brutal question: how does a state sustain violence beyond the limits of its immediate resources? From tribute and plunder to bonds and deficit spending, war finance reveals how power, trust, and money evolve under extreme pressure. In the ancient world, war financed itself through conquest. Armies marched not only to defeat enemies, but to seize grain, livestock, land, and people. Tribute was the earliest war tax imposed on the defeated to fund the next campaign. Empires like Assyria, Persia, and later Rome relied on this logic. Victory replenished the treasury. Defeat meant collapse. This system worked only as long as expansion continued. Once borders stabilized, plunder dried up, and states were forced to turn inward. Rome's transition from conquest to taxation marked a critical shift. War was no longer episodic. It became permanent. To sustain legions year after year, emperors debased coinage, raised taxes, and borrowed against future revenue, quietly inventing inflationary war finance long before the concept existed. Medieval warfare retained this extractive logic, but added fragmentation. Kings lacked centralized tax systems, so they relied on feudal obligations, church levies, and extraordinary demands on merchants. War was seasonal and limited by cash flow. When money ran out, armies disbanded. This constraint shaped strategy as much as terrain did. The inability to finance continuous war kept conflicts contained. But as states consolidated in the late Middle Ages, rulers learned a dangerous lesson. If you could tax reliably, you could fight indefinitely. The birth of permanent taxation was inseparable from the birth of permanent war. The early modern period transformed war finance fundamentally. Gunpowder navies and standing armies were expensive beyond anything tribute or feudal dues could sustain. States like Spain, France, and England turned to borrowing on an unprecedented scale. Merchant bankers financed kings not out of loyalty, but out of profit. War became a credit operation. Spain's repeated defaults in the 16th century revealed both the power and fragility of this system. As long as silver flowed from the Americas, creditors believed. When it faltered, confidence collapsed. War finance was no longer about seizing wealth. It was about convincing others to advance it. This is where the modern bond was born. The Dutch Republic, locked in existential war with Spain, pioneered public debt markets backed by credible taxation and representative institutions. Investors believed the state would honor its obligations because they had a voice in governance. England refined this model further after the Glorious Revolution. The creation of the Bank of England in 1694 was not about financial stability in the abstract. It was about financing war against France. Government bonds allowed the state to convert future tax revenue into immediate military power. War was no longer limited by current wealth, but by trust in the state's future. The implications were enormous. States that could borrow cheaply could outfight richer rivals. Britain's victory over France in the 18th and 19th centuries was as much a triumph of finance as of arms. Bondholders replaced plunder as the backbone of war. The public became involuntary participants, taxed for decades to pay for battles long past. War debts outlived wars themselves, shaping budgets, politics, and class relations. For the first time, war finance tied ordinary citizens to distant conflicts through long-term obligation rather than immediate sacrifice. The 19th century industrialized this system. Mass armies required mass funding. Railways, weapons, factories, and logistics networks demanded capital at scale. Governments issued bonds not just to elites, but to the public, transforming patriotism into investment. Buying war bonds became a civic duty. War finance entered households. The future earnings of entire populations were pledged to sustain present destruction. This marked a profound psychological shift. War was no longer paid for only by the defeated or the wealthy, but by society as a whole over generations. The world wars of the 20th century pushed this logic to its limit. Total war required total finance. Taxation expanded dramatically. Deficit spending became normal. Central banks monetized debt. Inflation was tolerated as a hidden tax. The distinction between fiscal and monetary policy blurred under necessity. World War II in particular demonstrated that governments could mobilize economic resources on a scale previously unimaginable if survival was at stake. After the war, this capacity did not disappear. It became embedded in the modern state. What history makes clear is that each method of financing war carries consequences long after the fighting ends. Tribute breeds rebellion. Taxation breeds resistance. Debt breeds dependency. Inflation breeds mistrust. Bonds feel painless at issuance, but become political constraints for decades. War finance shapes not only who wins conflicts, but how societies are organized afterward. Welfare states, income taxes, central banks, and public debt markets all trace part of their lineage to the demands of war. And it is here at the point where war financing shifts fully from immediate extraction to long-term promises that the deeper question emerges, because once states learn they can fight by borrowing against the future, the natural limit on war disappears, and the decision to fight becomes less about capacity and more about political will and credibility. Setting the stage for a modern world in which conflicts are sustained, not by plunder, but by balance sheets, confidence, and the willingness of populations to believe that the debt incurred today is worth paying tomorrow as the story moves toward that future. Because once war is financed by promises rather than plunder, it reshapes not only how wars are fought, but how peace is lived. In the modern era, war finance no longer ends with the signing of treaties. It lingers in budgets, inflation rates, and political choices long after the last shot is fired. Public debt accumulated in conflict becomes a permanent feature of the state, quietly influencing everything from social spending to monetary policy. History shows that the true cost of war is rarely paid on the battlefield. It is paid gradually by generations who inherit obligations without having made the decision that created them. The 20th century made this reality unmistakable. After World War I, Europe was burdened by interlocking war debts and reparations that strangled recovery and poisoned international relations. Governments attempted to service debts through austerity and deflation, sacrificing employment and stability to preserve financial credibility. The result was not peace, but resentment and collapse. Here, history delivered one of its clearest warnings. War debts, if mismanaged, can destabilize peace more effectively than armies ever could. Financial obligations became political weapons, and balance sheets became battlegrounds. World War II marked a turning point in how states internalized this lesson. Rather than insisting on immediate repayment, governments accepted inflation, financial repression, and long-term growth as tools to erode war debt quietly over time. Bonds were still issued, taxes were still raised, but the post-war order recognized that insisting on purity would destroy legitimacy. Central banks held government debt. Interest rates were capped. Growth was prioritized. This was war finance's final evolution, debt absorbed not through punishment, but through patience. The modern fiscal state was born from this compromise. In the Cold War and beyond, war financing became even more abstract. Direct conflict was limited, but military preparedness was constant. Defense budgets became structural financed through routine taxation and rolling debt rather than emergency measures. Wars were no longer framed as exceptional events requiring extraordinary sacrifice, but as manageable expenditures within normal fiscal frameworks. This normalization changed public psychology. When war is financed through deficits, rather than visible taxation, its cost feels distant. Political resistance weakens. History shows that how war is financed directly affects how easily it is justified. In the 21st century, this dynamic has intensified. Modern conflicts are often funded through borrowing in deep liquid bond markets that barely register disruption. Investors price risk, not morality. As long as confidence in state solvency holds, war finance appears sustainable. Yet history urges caution. Debt-funded conflict relies on one fragile assumption: continued belief. If credibility cracks through inflation, political instability, or strategic overreach, the cost of war financing rises sharply, forcing abrupt adjustment. The reckoning is delayed, not denied. The deepest lesson from the long history of war finance is therefore not technical, but ethical. Every method of financing war shifts pain differently across society and time. Tribute burdens the conquered. Taxes burden the present. Inflation burdens savers. Debt burdens the future. There is no painless choice, only less visible ones. When states choose bonds, they choose to fight today and ask tomorrow to pay. This choice can be justified in existential moments. It becomes dangerous when it becomes routine. Understanding how wars are financed reveals something uncomfortable about modern power. The ability to borrow indefinitely is not merely a financial privilege, it is a strategic one. States with deep capital markets can sustain conflict longer, absorb shocks better, and postpone consequence. This creates an asymmetry where financial strength substitutes for restraint. History shows us that systems capable of sustaining war without immediate sacrifice must consciously impose their own limits or risk discovering those limits only after damage has compounded beyond repair. If this journey through the history of war finance has deepened your understanding of how money, power, and conflict intertwine, I invite you to subscribe and continue exploring these financial histories with me, and to leave a comment sharing which method of war financing you believe has had the most lasting impact on the modern world. Because history reminds us that wars may be decided by battles, but they are endured, remembered, and repaid through finance long after the flags have been lowered and the future begins paying for the past.